Apple killed Facebook's business model, then quietly built its own, and called it privacy. In April 2021, Apple shipped a tiny permission box inside every iPhone. It asked one question: allow this app to track your activity across other companies' apps and websites? Most people said no, and that single choice set off one of the biggest shifts in the history of digital advertising. Facebook, Snap, YouTube, and Twitter lost an estimated $10 billion in revenue. Snap's stock fell 25% in a single day. Zuckerberg went on earnings calls and blamed Apple by name. While all of that was happening, Apple's own ad business was quietly growing. This is the story of how the world's most valuable company built a weapon, wrapped it in a moral argument, and called it privacy, and how almost everyone, including the people it was aimed at, missed what was hiding inside. To understand how Apple became the gatekeeper of the advertising economy, you have to go back to when Apple was the company that wanted nothing to do with it. Steve Jobs launched the iPhone in 2007. It wasn't just a phone, it was a walled garden. Apple controlled the operating system. Apple controlled the App Store. Apple decided what apps could run on your device and what they were allowed to do. Jobs called it user experience. His critics called it control. In 2010, Jobs took direct aim at Google. The two companies had been partners. Google apps came pre-installed on the iPhone, but the relationship was fraying. Jobs said publicly that privacy meant people knowing what they're signing up for, in plain English and repeatedly. Google, in his view, did not do that. Apple's business model was simple. You pay for the hardware, they leave you alone. No ad network, no behavioral profiles. Just a clean device and a clean conscience. That was the story. Here's the footnote. By 2016, iPhone sales had peaked. Wall Street was nervous, so Tim Cook made a decision that would define the next decade. Apple would grow services, the App Store cut, iCloud, Apple Music, and a deal with Google. Google paid Apple to be the default search engine in Safari on every iPhone sold. By 2022, that deal was worth an estimated $15 billion a year. By 2023, estimates from the Department of Justice antitrust trial put it at $18 billion. Apple, the privacy company, was collecting tens of billions of dollars a year from the largest data collection business in the world. The detail wasn't hidden. It was in the footnotes of Apple's annual report. But almost no one was reading the fine print. Then 2018 happened. In March of that year, the Cambridge Analytica story broke. Facebook had allowed a political consultancy to harvest the personal data of 87 million users without their knowledge. Zuckerberg was summoned to Congress. Advertisers threatened to leave. Regulators in Europe and the United States started paying attention in a way they hadn't before. Tim Cook had an opinion. He wrote an op-ed calling out Facebook's business model. He gave interviews saying that privacy was a fundamental human right, not a business strategy. He was sincere. He was also watching what the scandal was doing to his biggest competitor's reputation. Because what happened to Facebook between 2018 and 2021 was, from Apple's point of view, an opening. Every privacy scandal that hit a social media platform made Apple's hardware business look safer. Every congressional hearing made Cook's op-eds look prescient. Apple started running billboards that said, "What happens on your iPhone stays on your iPhone." Privacy was becoming the brand. And a brand is only valuable when your competitors are destroying theirs. By 2020, Apple had made a decision. Every app on the App Store would be required to get explicit permission before tracking users across other companies' apps and websites. No more invisible tracking pixels. No more hidden data brokers. Users would get a choice. What the announcement didn't say was this: the choice only applied to other companies. The announcement came on January 28, 2021. Tim Cook was invited to keynote one of the most important privacy conferences in Europe, CPDP, in Brussels. It was Data Privacy Day. He appeared via video link and delivered the speech of his career. He described what he called the data industrial complex, an interconnected ecosystem of companies and data brokers. He used these words: of purveyors of fake news and peddlers of division, of trackers and hucksters just looking to make a quick buck. He said that in this system, no piece of information is too private or personal to be surveilled, monetized, and aggregated into a 360-degree view of your life. He said, "You are no longer the customer, you're the product." And then he landed the line that would echo through tech journalism for years. A social dilemma cannot be allowed to become a social catastrophe. It was a genuinely powerful argument. It named real harms. The tracking economy had done real damage to privacy, to democracy, to how people move through the world. Cook was not inventing the crisis he described, but there was something he didn't say that day. Apple's own apps, music, news, TV, Plus, fitness, would not be required to show the new tracking permission prompt. Because under Apple's own definition, Apple's data collection didn't count as tracking across other companies' apps. It was first-party data, Apple's own data, exempt by design. And if you wanted to control whether Apple itself showed you personalized ads, you had to go to Settings, scroll to Privacy and Security, tap Apple advertising, and toggle off a switch most people never knew existed. One standard for the platform, another for everyone else. Read the fine print. 3 months later, iOS 14.5 shipped. On April 26, 2021, every iPhone in the world received a software update, and inside it, that permission prompt. The question appeared in every app. Opt-in rates across the industry settled at around 25%, which meant 3 out of 4 iPhone users were now invisible to the ad platforms that had been tracking them for years. The effects hit fast. Snap was the first major casualty. In its first earnings report after ATT, Snap warned that the changes had broken its ability to target and measure ads. Its stock dropped 25% in a single day. Zuckerberg, who rarely calls out a competitor by name in public, spent multiple earnings calls directly blaming Apple. In late 2021, Meta estimated the tracking changes had cost it $10 billion in revenue. And by the second quarter of 2022, Facebook's parent company reported its first ever quarterly revenue decline in history. Ad impressions were up 15%. Revenue was still down. More ads, worse results. Twitter was hit. YouTube was hit. Every platform built on knowing who you were and what you had bought took a hit. And Apple Search Ads, which runs inside the App Store using Apple's own first-party data, exempt from the tracking prompt, grew sharply. Apple's ad business went from roughly $1.4 billion in 2020 to an estimated $3.7 billion in 2021 and $5 billion by 2022. The companies that built the surveillance economy were bleeding. Apple was building its own version, quietly, inside the one place where every app install on every iPhone begins. Let's go back to that January 2021 speech for a moment, because there's something important about the way Tim Cook framed his argument that tends to get lost in the coverage. Cook wasn't just describing a privacy problem. He was describing the entire business model of Apple's biggest competitors. Google's business runs on search advertising powered by behavioral data. Meta's business runs on social advertising powered by behavioral data. Both companies had built some of the most valuable enterprises in human history by doing exactly what Cook was condemning. The data industrial complex he described in Brussels, that was them. Apple's business was different, he implied. Apple sells hardware. Apple sells subscriptions. Apple takes a cut of every transaction that goes through its App Store. In Cook's framing, Apple was the alternative, the company that made money from your subscription fee, not from selling your attention to the highest bidder. It was a clean story, and it was mostly true, because Apple Search Ads, the ad product Apple runs inside the App Store, also knows who you are. Apple knows what apps you've downloaded. Apple knows what you've bought through its payment system. Apple knows your interests and your categories from everything you've searched in the App Store. This is Apple's own first-party data. No tracking prompt needed, no IDFA required, no consent dialogue beyond the terms you agreed to when you first set up your phone. And the companies paying for Apple Search Ads after ATT. They included Meta and Google, and every company that had just lost access to the iOS tracking signals Apple removed. They were buying back access to Apple's users, from Apple, through the only approved channel left. Think about what that means. Apple removed the tool that let competitors reach its users. Then Apple sold access to those same users through its own system. The surveillance economy didn't end. It got reorganized. Apple became its landlord. In late 2021, the research firm Lockdown Privacy ran an independent study. They found that sophisticated third-party tracking still continued in many popular apps, even after users declined the ATT prompt. The change was structural. ATT didn't eliminate surveillance. It centralized it. The data industrial complex Cook described in Brussels is real. Apple just moved it inside its own walls. 4 years later, the numbers tell the full story. Apple Search Ads revenue was roughly $3.5 billion in 2021, around $5 billion in 2022. Industry analysts estimate the business has continued to grow substantially since, powered by the same iOS install economy, ATT reshaped. Apple's services segment, which includes the ad business, the App Store commission, iCloud, Apple Music, Apple TV Plus, and that Google deal, hit $85.2 billion in fiscal year 2023, then $96.2 billion in fiscal year 2024. Services now makes up about 25% of everything Apple earns. The margin on services is far higher than on iPhones. Services is where the profit lives, and advertising is inside it. Regulators started putting a name on what they were seeing. France's competition authority fined Apple $150 million in 2025. Specifically for app tracking transparency. The French regulator found that ATT constituted an abuse of dominant position. Apple had applied rules to third-party developers that it did not apply to itself. It was the first regulatory finding to say what critics had argued for 4 years. ATT wasn't just a privacy feature, it was a competitive weapon. The European Commission followed with its first ever non-compliance decision under the Digital Markets Act. The fine, $500 million, again, Apple. And on March 21, 2024, the United States Department of Justice filed a monopolization lawsuit against Apple, alleging that the company had used its control of iOS to systematically suppress rival technologies and maintain dominance over the smartphone market. Apple called all of it an attack on privacy protection. Now here is the number that makes everything else make sense. During the DOJ antitrust trial against Google, the court heard testimony about what Google pays Apple each year to be the default search engine in Safari. The figure that emerged, between $18 billion and $20 billion per year. Apple, the company that stood in Brussels and warned the world about trackers and hucksters, about the data industrial complex, about the freedom to be human, collects more money from Google than most Fortune 500 companies earn in the total annual revenue, for the right to be the search engine that appears the moment you open Safari, on your privacy phone. Apple is not in the privacy business. Apple is in the platform business. Privacy is the feature that keeps you inside. Cook's Brussels speech ended with a question. He said, "If we accept as normal and unavoidable that everything in our lives can be aggregated and sold, then we lose so much more than data. We lose the freedom to be human." It's a beautiful line, and it implies a clean choice, a world with surveillance versus a world without it. But the world Apple built is more complicated than that. Every time you tapped Ask App Not to Track, you handed Apple a mandate. You confirmed that you trusted Apple's privacy brand. You confirmed that Apple's App Store was where your apps would come from. You stayed inside the garden. That is not a con. Apple has done real things for real privacy. ATT did reduce third-party tracking. The iPhone is, in many ways, a more private device than the alternatives. Cook's argument was not a lie. But the company that sells you privacy also controls where your apps come from, what those apps are allowed to do, how they can pay you, who can reach you, and at what price. It collects between $18 and $20 billion a year from the largest data company in the world. And it doesn't report any of this as advertising revenue. Privacy has a landlord now. The rent is paid in trust, and the fine print was always there, right in the open where almost nobody looked.